Good morning. I'm really glad you're with us for one of our semi-annual, semi-regular Gary Hall in the Summer in the Forum events. We like to take advantage of Gary being with us and make him work every minute that he's on campus. So that's why we do these forums. Special welcome to those joining us by streaming, which we are really happy we could pull off this morning. Grateful to Keith for coming in from vacation to do that. So just if you're new, if you're visiting us, we have a couple suggestions for you. We would like for you to stop at the Red Welcome table upstairs and pick up a Red Welcome bag. And there are green sheets on a clipboard over here. Give us your email address and we'll get you on our list to get information about all upcoming forums. We start the Rectors Forum again in October, and we're already booking some very exciting people. So we're glad about that. And we would not be able to offer the kind of enlightening and important speakers that we have in the Rectors Forum without your financial support. So if you're not a pledger, we would encourage you to get a pledge card from church or from the welcome table and join us in this enterprise, become part of our mission. So we have Gary Hall with us this morning, and Gary is part of one of the great secrets to the success of All Saints Church is that we have a wonderful group of adjunct clergy, of people who have retired from active clergy, well, I guess they're still active, retired from paid clergy work, and still and still hang around this place and bring all of their wisdom and their gifts and their energy to us here. And we're so thrilled that after Gary retired as Dean of the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., he landed here back with us for, I think, the third time. And we are thrilled that he's with us this morning. So I'm not going to spend any more time telling you about Gary because you know him and you love him. Here's Gary Hall.
So let's see how much I can say without getting All Saints in trouble with the Internal Revenue Service. Well, we have lived through a couple of interesting weeks in America. Susan Russell said to me today that the number one Googled word this month is dystopian. And certainly the week in Cleveland did feel like an episode of the Hunger Games. And last week in Philadelphia, I thought I was at a VFW march or something with one of those flags. This came about because I used to work here, as you know, and I used to be an English teacher before I worked here. And I've done on and off classes and forums about Shakespeare. And my engagement with Shakespeare really is a kind of theological engagement. When I was a seminary dean in Evanston, I taught a class on Shakespeare and on the theological issues in Shakespeare. There's a lot of controversy about whether Shakespeare was a Protestant or a Catholic. I tend to think he was probably a Catholic, but I'm not interested in that particular argument. I am interested in the way that Shakespeare's plays really enact theological problems and really wrestle with theological problems at a very deep level. And so I started doing that when I was at Seabury, and then I would come here and do forums about Shakespeare over that period of time. And Christina called me up and said, would you be interested in doing something on Shakespeare this summer? And, I was trying to think of Shakespeare's diet tips, I just retired, so maybe looking at The Tempest as like a text about retirement or something. But instead of that, I was having lunch with my friend Larry Dilge, who's sitting down next to Kathy, and Larry just said, well, Shakespeare in Succession, and he was right. I mean, right now in our culture, we're going through a major thing about succession in our national government. We're going to have a different president in January of 2017. This parish is going through a succession. We're in the transition between rectors. And remember, rector I used to teach polity and canon law. Rector is from the Latin rex, which means king. And so it actually is. And so the rector is the most powerful person in Anglican polity. And so the kind of rector transition, especially in a place like All Saints that has a very high theology of its rector, is a big issue in this place's life. And then many of you probably know that the Diocese of Los Angeles is electing a new bishop in December. So I originally wanted to call this Game of Miters, Game of Thrones, which I thought was a pretty catchy title. We're sort of in the dark about the bishop election process and what that will look like. So we're all in this moment of transition, both nationally and in our ecclesiastical life. And so it did seem good to think about the ways in which Shakespeare might speak to that. Now, after I wrote the blurb from this, I really decided that the play that makes the most sense to talk about, and it's not one of Shakespeare's most familiar plays, is the play Richard II. And I have a set of handouts that I'm going to pass out in a second that will give you some quotes to work with. Richard II is the first play in the group of plays that has been called the Henriad. And we're more familiar with the other three: Henry IV, Part 1, Henry IV, Part 2, and Henry V. Shakespeare actually wrote two what we call tetralogies, sets of 4 plays. The first is the Henry VI, Part 1, 2, and 3, and Richard III, which actually take place after these plays. And then the second one he wrote was the Henriad, the plays that deal with the deposition of King Richard II, the ascension of King Henry IV, and then the final stabilization of things under Henry V. And before I pass out the handout, I want to say just a little bit about the 1590s. There was a history play boom in the 1590s. If you remember roughly Shakespeare's dates, 1564 to 1616. Queen Elizabeth was queen from 1559 until 1603. You remember that Queen Elizabeth did not marry and so had no heirs. And in the 1590s, as she was approaching old age, she was approaching death, her inevitable death, there was a lot of anxiety about the succession. And so there was a boom in history plays. They didn't really exist before the 1590s. Nobody really wrote kind of plays about English history before the 1590s. But Shakespeare really sort of invented the genre and wrote these history plays. And they existed really as a response to that anxiety. Elizabeth made it a capital crime publicly to speak about the succession. In other words, it was against the law even to kind of bring it up, It was like saying, if someone said, well, there's going to be an election in November, and they immediately were sent to the gas chamber or the needle. It was like, we'll pretend it isn't happening. And so it was illegal to even talk about succession, much less write a play about succession. And so Shakespeare, canny fellow that he was, realized that he could deal with the issues of his own day. It's kind of like science fiction, when you read science fiction and it's about these bug-eyed monsters on Mars, but it's really about, Donald Trump or something. In other words, it's, that there's a way in which there's obviously an analogy, right? So the great Marjorie Garber, whose book Shakespeare After All is probably my favorite commentary on Shakespeare's plays, the great Marjorie Garber, who teaches at Harvard, says, all history plays are about 3 time periods. They're about the time period enacted on stage. They're about the time period in which they were first performed. and they're about the time period in which we're watching the production or reading it. So in some ways, in the same way that Gone with the Wind tells you more about the Depression in America than it does about the Civil War, I'll never be hungry again, In the same way that Gone with the Wind is more about the 1930s than the 1860s, so Richard II and the Henry plays are more about the late 16th century than they are about the late 14th century. And similarly, when you see a production of Richard II in our own day, it will be more about issues in our own day. So Richard II is variously portrayed as a kind of fascist dictator or a fop or a Christ figure based on how we feel about these issues of authority and legitimacy in our own age. So Richard II and all of these plays that Shakespeare wrote depict moments of transition. Interestingly about Shakespeare's history plays, if you just think about the productions you've seen of Henry IV, Part 1 and 2, and Henry V, and Richard III, which are the plays that we see most often, there are no history plays about long settled reigns. They are all about these moments when power changes hands. In the tetralogy, that takes place over a long sweep, but in each individual play there is a change of power, a transfer of power. Richard II was written in 1595. It was published and first performed in 1595. It was published in a quarto in 1597. It was originally called The Tragedy of King Richard II, and the play feels one way if you read it as a tragedy with and I'll just summarize the story in a second, but the centerpiece of it is a king who isn't a very good king, and then is deposed and loses his crown and eventually is murdered. And then the new king, Bolingbroke, who becomes Henry IV, both assumes the crown and then his legitimacy is confirmed when the king, in fact, dies. So Shakespeare wrote in 1595. The other plays he was writing in 1595 were A Midsummer Night's Dream and Romeo and Juliet. It was interesting that after he finished the Henry plays, he gave up writing history plays, and he looked at some of the issues in individual plays, in individual tragedies. So, for example, in Julius Caesar, the killing of Caesar takes place in the middle of the play, and what you have is the decision to kill Caesar early on, the murder of Caesar, and then the new government goes in place and that government falls apart. So you see both the killing of a despot in some way, but also what happens when illegitimate authority tries to ascend the seat of power. The other play he wrote that's about some of the same issues is Macbeth. And again, you have Duncan is killed fairly early in the play, Macbeth becomes the king, and then you see Macbeth unravel and lose the crown. And so in all of these plays you get this sense that we're often given the choice between a legitimate but bad ruler and an illegitimate but effective ruler. Now, part of that's because we're going through this transition from a medieval theory about rulership, the divine right of kings, to a modern theory of leadership, which is more pragmatic. So in Richard II, Richard is a terrible king. He doesn't govern very effectively. He's very introverted. He's kind of like Hamlet. He's very inward and interior in his life. He spends way too much money on himself and on excesses. But he's the king. He's the authorized king. He's deposed by a man, Bolingbroke, who becomes Henry IV, who is a very good pragmatic ruler, but is still not the authorized king. And when you read the other Henry plays, you discover that things aren't right until finally his son, Prince Hal, who becomes Henry V, things don't finally get put right until there is, again, a legitimate heir on the throne. I want to talk about a couple of other issues and then pass out a couple of this sheet with some passages on it. One of them is, and they're kind of literary issues, one of them is, I would say, that is a kind of the royal metaphor, in the same way, bishops talk about, kings and bishops talk about themselves as their, when I was first ordained, bishops would sign their letters, Robert Los Angeles. Or Paul, New York. I mean, that was actually a real thing. Bishops, and you see what's his name? The Bishop of Canterbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury signs his name, Jeremy, is that his name? I forget. Justin, right. Justin, he signs his name Justin Cantuar, which is Justin Canterbury. That's a kind of natural thing. When I was working for Bishop Brusac, he got a letter from the Bishop of Western New York, signed William, Western New York, and he wrote back, "Dear Buffalo Bill," which I thought... If you knew Robert Brusac, that was one of the very few funny things that he ever did, but I thought it was hilarious. Well, and like when Antony says to Cleopatra, "I am dying, Egypt dying," I mean, he addresses her as Egypt. I mean, so it is customary for the king, this royal metaphor, the body of the king is the body politic. And so the king is the nation. And so we live under this royal metaphor. Now, in the cosmology of both the late Middle Ages and the early modern world, the things don't go well when the wrong person is on the throne. And the best... But the problem for us moderns is they don't go all that well when even the right person is on the throne. So... And so, for example, the best example of this is Hamlet, right? There's something rotten in the state of Denmark. Denmark's a prison. Everything is terrible in Denmark. There are all these signs and portents in the sky because Claudius has killed King Hamlet. And it won't be all right until Fortinbras gets on the throne. So there's this sense that things are terrible when the wrong person is on the throne, and the way to heal the society is to heal the court. Now, despite my sister's ejaculation a moment ago, I'm not sure we believe that. I mean, I've heard many people say they were going to move after Cleveland. They were going to move to Canada, New Zealand, some other English-speaking Commonwealth country if a certain person got elected. I remember people saying that in 2000, 2004, and I don't know anybody who actually ever moved to Canada or New Zealand as a result of a presidential election. There may be somebody, but frankly, I don't think we buy into this idea in the same way that our forebears did. Global warming is not because, I mean, obviously there are policy reasons, but our social ills or the health of our nation is not, we have a much more functional vision of leadership than a kind of theological vision of leadership. The other idea is that the king is a kind of literary idea called the two bodies of the king. That the king has two bodies. The king has a physical body. There is the person of the king, and then there is also the kind of body politic. So the king, the king is an actual human being, and the king is subject to age and decay. But the political body of the king goes on, and so the king is dead. Long live the king. It's a seamless transition in the king's authority because finally the body of the king is not just the actual person inhabiting that role, but it is in fact the role itself. So we have in the story of Richard II the story of a king who is the legitimate king, but a very poor king. He, through a series of things, decides when John of Gaunt, without going through all the genealogy, there are three brothers who have three sons, and then Richard's father dies, and Richard becomes king. One other brother, the Duke of York, and then the other brother, John of Gaunt. John of Gaunt has a son named Bolingbroke, who will become Henry IV. Richard banishes Bolingbroke for a complex set of reasons I'm not going to go into. When John of Gaunt dies, Richard seizes his property essentially to pay for his war in Ireland, and Bolingbroke comes back ostensibly to get his property back that he should have inherited from his father, but that Richard is in a sense appropriated without compensation. But then it's clear that everybody sides with Bolingbroke, and so Richard ends up having to abdicate the throne, which he does, and then he goes to prison and is murdered, and then Bolingbroke becomes the kind of legitimate king at the end of the play, and the play ends with the new king, Henry IV, saying that he will go and lead a crusade to the Holy Land in penance for his role of having usurped a legitimate king. So the question that oversees this play is, does William Shakespeare take sides? Does he side with Richard as the legitimate king, or with Henry as the kind of more able king? And really, when you read the text carefully, it's true that he does not, but that productions do. Okay, having said that, I now turn to my attractive assistant, Anina, and ask her to pass out the handouts. Now, I'm not going to have time to go through all of these handouts because I've over-prepared, but I do want to begin on the second page, on the back side of this handout, with passage number 4. Passage number 4 is from Act 4, Scene 1, and that is the scene in which Richard renounces the crown and the scepter and the orb and hands it to Bolingbroke, who then becomes crowned later in the play. When this play was performed and printed in the quarto of 1597, the deposition scene was not printed in it. The deposition scene was not printed until the first folio, long after Shakespeare's death. So it's clear that this was seen as the most politically dangerous scene in the play. The idea of it was produced, we believe, but not printed. And interestingly enough, when the Earl of Essex, if you remember, Essex tried to get back in favor with Elizabeth, led an excursion to Ireland and came back and tried to lead a rebellion. Before the Essex Rebellion, his followers paid the Lord Chamberlain's men to perform this play with this scene in it as a way of kind of spurring on their revolt. It didn't work, and they were all put to death, including Essex. So this play had a very charged political history in Elizabeth's own time. So this is the scene where Richard is handing the crown to Bolingbroke, and oftentimes it's staged with them both having their hands on it at the same time. And Richard says, "Give me the crown. Here, cousin, seize the crown. Here, cousin, on this side my hand, on that side yours. Now is this golden crown like a deep well that has two buckets, filling one another. So you imagine almost these buckets on a pulley going into and out of a well. The crown itself is the well. The emptier ever dancing in the air, the other down unseen and full of water. That bucket down and full of tears am I, drinking my griefs whilst you mount up on high. So in one sense, you've got this image there, the kingship, the crown, is compared to a well. It's a kind of a void. And actually in another speech, Richard calls the space within the space where his head goes, the hollow crown, which is death's territory. That's in an earlier speech. Here in this speech, he's comparing the crown to a well and to two buckets, one empty, one full, that are in this constant sense of emptying and replenishing one another. So in some sense, this image is an image of the kind of seamless transition of authority. Whether illegitimate or legitimate, power changes hands, and yet that power always resides in the same crown. That's one major metaphor in the play for royal authority. And then here's a second metaphor right below it, or actually they're both similes. This is the Duke of York. This is in Act 5 when the Duke of York comes back and tells his wife, sort of depicts to his wife how the coronation went. And he says, as in a theater, and remember Shakespeare uses acting all over the place in his plays, life is but a stage, etc., the 7 ages of man, all of those speeches. As in a theater, the eyes of men, after a well-graced actor leaves the stage, are idly bent on him that enters next, thinking his prattle to be tedious. Even so, or with much more contempt, men's eyes did scowl on Richard. On gentle Richard, no man cried, God save him. So the first metaphor is a metaphor of, or a simile comparing the crown to a well where buckets make a kind of seamless emptying and filling. The other is the image of a theater. As Emerson said, power ceases in the moment of repose. As in Hollywood, they say, what have you done for me lately? Richard, the minute Richard becomes a has-been king, he is of no longer of interest to the crowd, and interest focuses solely on the new king. Not legitimate king, not rightful king, but nevertheless the one who actually has the authority. So there are these two major comparisons about authority. Here's the other one I want to look at, and then just open it for some conversation. The most famous speech in the play is the first passage at the top of page 1. And usually we only quote the familiar part of it, but I reprinted the whole speech. And this is John of Gaunt, who is Bolingbroke's father, who's dying. He's been summoned. He has summoned Richard to his house because he's dying. And Richard is his nephew. Richard says, before he goes there, let's get there fast, but hope we get there too late, because he doesn't want to have to listen to his gas bag uncle, but instead, and just wants to seize his property, which he does right after this speech. But this is the speech that is, that we tend to, especially if you're spending time in England, that people tend to quote, especially in election campaigns. This royal throne of kings, this sceptered isle, this earth of majesty, this seat of Mars, actually it sounds like the Democratic Convention, this other Eden, demi-paradise, this fortress built by nature for herself this is Make England Great Again, right? against infection and the hands of war. This happy breed of men, this little world, this precious stone set in a silver sea. Notice how long the subject, the referent, there's all these demonstrative pronouns. We don't get the actual subject till way late in the sentence, which serves it in the office of a wall, or as a moat defensive to a house against the envy of less happier lands, this blessed plot, this earth, this realm, this England, this nurse, this teeming womb of royal kings, feared by their breed and famous by their birth, renowned for their deeds as far from home, for Christian service as true chivalry, as is the sepulchre in stubborn Jewry of the world's ransom, blessed Mary's Son. England is as precious as the tomb of Jesus, this land of such dear souls, this dear, dear land, dear for her reputation through the world. Okay, Hillary Clinton could have spoken that speech. Barack Obama could have spoken that speech. General Allen could have shouted that speech. This is American exceptionalism, American civil religion transplanted to England. This is patriotic fervor. We're the greatest country in the world, the most beautiful land in the world. We're the greatest. We're number one. USA, USA, UK, UK, UK. You can hear people shouting. Okay. That's the first part of the speech. That's the familiar part of the speech. Then John of Gaunt goes on and he modulates into another presidential candidate. This land of ours is now leased out. I die pronouncing it like to a tenement or pelting, means very small, farm. England bound in with a triumphant sea whose rocky shore beats back the envious siege of watery Neptune is now bound in with shame, with inky blots and rotten parchment bonds. He had to borrow a bunch of money. The king had to borrow a bunch of money. That England that was wont to conquer others hath made a shameful conquest of itself. Ah, would the scandal vanish with my life. How happy then were my ensuing death. I mean, that is Donald Trump's argument spoken by John of Gaunt. The country is going to hell. And I alone, he doesn't say I alone can fix it because he is in fact on his deathbed. But it is that argument of both sort of exceptionalism and crisis. So Shakespeare, in some sense, I guess here's my point, and then I want to just make my concluding points and then open it up to observations or questions. So Shakespeare, as in everything, never really takes a position. I mean, he's wily. He doesn't come down on one side or the other. Yes, Richard is a tragic figure, and if you read the play as a tragedy, if you produce the play as a tragedy, all your feeling goes to Richard as a tragic figure because he falls from a great height and he dies. And he kind of learns, has that moment of tragic insight, he learns that he wasn't very much of a king, and he probably shouldn't have been a king given his character. But in terms of whether we're better off under, the flag wavers or the carpers, he doesn't really take a position. But he does note this transition from the medieval to the modern frame of understanding the world. You and I no longer inhabit a world where whoever sits in the White House occupies. I don't get up every morning, even as crazy as I am for following politics, even when we've had presidents I couldn't stand, I didn't get up every morning thinking the first thing about, oh my God, so-and-so's in the White House. And when I've had a president I love, like I have actually come really to love the current president, I don't get up every morning and say, thank God so-and-so's in the White House. It's not a part of my functional daily life, I think, in the way that it was a part of a medieval person's daily life, because the president doesn't take on the same symbolism. And that's one of the problems with our liturgical language. When we talk about Jesus Christ as Lord, that's a meaningless term in the 21st century. We don't have lords in our culture, I mean, lords, I mean, the royalty are for us Americans kind of figures of fool, so foolishness. So for me to say Jesus is Lord feels, is Jesus King, Prince Charles? I mean, no, that's not the right metaphor. Do I want to say Jesus is the President of the United States? Well, that's a little too much in the other direction. So one of the problems we have with our liturgical and theological language about authority is the language that our tradition gives us doesn't mean anything in our culture. And so it's very hard, Jesus is my senator, I mean, I don't know. Jesus is my county supervisor, I mean, doesn't... But he does note and dramatize the anxiety that accompanies transfers of power. In the Henriette, Bolingbroke may have done the right thing in overthrowing Richard, but he will never be at ease, and the country will never be at ease until his son, his natural heir, assumes the throne. He is still, Shakespeare is still enough of a medieval thinker to believe that in Hamlet's phrase, the time is out of joint when the social order, the cosmic order is disrupted when the social order is disrupted because they mirror each other. So the wrong person on the throne means that things are disturbed everywhere. You and I don't quite believe that, and we don't participate in that royal metaphor. But I do think that we are profoundly anxious in moments of transition, and I think that Shakespeare, while he doesn't give us an answer, does show us that somehow systems prevail and that human beings prevail, and that there is, in those images, those two buckets filling and emptying the well, there is this, whether or not our fears or our hopes are enacted in the election this fall, there is something abiding in the body politic that we can celebrate and give thanks for. So let me stop there, and then I know someone, if this is all saying, someone disagrees with most of what I said, so I'd be happy to hear, or has other thoughts about Shakespeare, transition, and succession.
Thank you so much for being here. The issue with Trump is that I'll speak for myself. I'm terrified because of the comparisons that have been made with him and the rise of Hitler. So he's not your traditional run-of-the-mill crazy leader. He's
Right.
extreme. So I've never thought about going to one of the battleground states and volunteering, but I'm seriously thinking of doing that now, and I've never had those thoughts of leaving California to do that.
Well, and Shakespeare does have, there are, I think of Coriolanus and Macbeth. There are some really bad actors in Shakespeare's, not bad actors, but bad rulers in Shakespeare's world, and Caesar too, for that matter. And they all eventually get undone. That there is this, again, faith in human processes that even tyrants will somehow be deposed. I share some of your thoughts about Trump, and I do perceive him as a danger. But I think in terms of at least what Shakespeare would remind us is that we do have and I think what I would remind us is that we do have a Constitution, which Mr. Kahn reminded us of so dramatically last week. I often don't cry during conventions, but that was, to me, one of the great moments. And I do think that at least what's interesting too about Shakespeare is Shakespeare has been read. If you remember E.M.W. Tilliard, who was the big post-war British historian, basically read Shakespeare as a conservative and as in favor of order. And so he read Richard II as a critique of the overthrow of an illegitimate king, of a bad king. But both in the time of Shakespeare and in the current day, this play is read much more in favor of overthrowing a bad monarch. So Shakespeare has been read both by Marxist and by conservative critics. The same texts have been both ways. But I certainly understand your alarm.
Here? Yes. I recently heard Salman Rushdie speak at a writers' conference, and he talked about a game he used to play with the late Christopher Hitchens, where they would come up with Robert Ludlum-like titles for Shakespearean plays. The prime example being the Elsinore Vacillation.
The Elsinore Vacillation.
I just wondered if you might think of a Ludlum-like title for Richard II.
Richard II. I'll think of it. You know, it's like all good retorts. I'll think of it in the middle of the service at 11:15.
We'll be waiting.
One question is, well, actually an interesting question. Does the first part of John of Gaunt's speech explain Brexit? Which is an interesting, Kathy and I and Larry were in, and some people from All Saints, were in Scotland at this trip to Iona right before the Brexit vote. And in Scotland, everybody was against Brexit, but if you listen to radio at all or watch television when you were there, it was all Brexit. I do think there is a kind of, you know, it's so interesting to hear people speak about American exceptionalism as if that's a good thing. You know, the term American exceptionalism was actually coined as a critique of thinking that America was better than any place else. But actually people now use it proudly to say, I'm for American exceptionalism, which says something about something. I don't know what it says. But I think there is a kind of British exceptionalism. And maybe that goes with, say what? Trafalgar Square and the statue of Nelson and all that, imperialism. It would be interesting to hear a post-colonialist reading of this text. I do think, though, this idea, I'm coming to believe, and I've always felt this, but I feel it even more strongly now, that even the idea of a nation state is kind of contrary to the gospel, right? I mean, the earliest Christians got persecuted because they wouldn't say that Caesar was king. That, you know, the emperor worship, you had to reverence the emperor as a god. And the earliest Christians went to the lions and the crosses because they would not say that. They said, we follow someone else with real authority. And that's what Jesus is Lord or Christ and is King really means. It doesn't mean that, you know, Jesus is Barack Obama. It means that Jesus claims my ultimate loyalty. Well, if that's the case, I think any nation state, even this country which we all love so much, even any nation state's claim to our ultimate allegiance is secondary to our claim to God's claim on our allegiance. And so I do think the idea of nation states is becoming increasingly problematic, and that's why I was a little uncomfortable with the display in Philadelphia, I have to say. I understood the reasons for it. I mean, I don't even get, you know, Cleveland was like watching a Vincent Price movie. So, I mean, I you know, The Pit and the Pendulum or something. I mean, like The Living Dead, you know. When I was in junior high, my friends and I all used to go see those Vincent Price movies in 7th grade, you know, and we'd scream and everything. But in Philadelphia, I got a little, you know, the number of flags began to really bother me just a touch. But that's me. I'm not saying that for everybody. But I do think, Susan raises the question about Brexit, I think any kind of national exceptionalism really needs to be under close scrutiny for a Christian person, for a person of faith, I think. Because I think nation states, even one like ours, which is founded on an idea more than on a piece of property, but nation states fundamentally still gather people in arbitrary groupings. And if there's anything that we read in both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, is that God is gathering the human community in a wholly new way which transcends any kind of division. And so that's the end of my sermon. Yes, there's another.
Okay, last question.
Last question. Yes.
I'm struck by how important the succession ideas, I think, are still important now. Mm-hmm. I recall with the Bush-Gore election, and that Al Gore made a point of saying we are transitioning, and he is my president now too. And that
Absolutely.
Obama walked George Bush to the helicopter with Barbara, in a very formal way, making a point that this is a peaceful transition. And it seems to me like the balloons and everything are about the fact that those ceremonies still matter,
Right.
per the ideas you talk about,
Right.
even though it's, still.
No, I agree with that. I think, you remember, though, I was thinking, I was going to look it up right before I came, but the first line of Kennedy's inaugural address was, "We celebrate today not a victory of party, we observe today not a celebration of party, but a victory of party, but a celebration of freedom." That was the first line of John F. Kennedy's inaugural address. Words to that effect. And I do think this idea of the peaceful transition of power, when again you think about English history, every time someone died there'd be a combat, and the most powerful person would emerge. And clearly in a settled society we need a peaceful transition. And I agree, even in 2000, I agreed that was the right thing for Gore to do, even though I thought that was a partisan Supreme Court decision. I don't know what I'm going to do if the Republican nominee is elected president, how I'm going to feel about a peaceful transition. I mean, I just got to say that, not speaking for this church in any way, but speaking for myself, I just don't know. But I agree with you that those are important. Those are really important symbolic things in our culture. And I think we all feel that we're in a moment where those symbols are getting, those ceremonies and observances are getting stretched to their limit right now. Okay. Thanks, everybody.